Good evening. First time. That's good. Good to see everybody here tonight. As we've been studying throughout the book of Genesis, there's been a common thread in the shortcomings of the characters we see, right? They've been given a promise of a God. They encounter a difficult situation and they try to take matters into their own hands, right? And losing their trust in God's promises. See Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Jacob and on. And we're going to see that again tonight. So we're going to begin our time together by singing "'Tis So Sweet to Trust in Jesus." So let's stand together and let's sing all four stanzas. "'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus." "'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus, just to take him at his word, just to rest upon his promise, and to know thus saith the Lord. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust him, how I proved him more and more. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust him more. Oh, how sweet to trust in Jesus, just to trust his cleansing blood, just in simple faith to plunge beneath the heaving cleansing flood. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust him, how I proved him more and more. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust him more. Yes, 'tis sweet to trust in Jesus, just from sin and self to cease, just from Jesus simply taking life and rest and joy and peace. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust him, how I proved him more and more. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust him more. I'm so glad I learned to trust him, precious Jesus, Savior, friend. And I know that he is with me, will be with me to the end. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust him, how I proved him more and more. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust him more. You may be seated. All right, we are in Genesis chapter 38 tonight. Genesis chapter 38. We're going to be looking tonight at really random, a really bizarre story about Judah. And in many ways, definitely not a PG-13 story of Judah. One that I am glad that am I not on? No. I'm on right here.
Whoop, nope. I'm on now. I was on, I wasn't plugged in. So I didn't lie, I told the truth. I was on, I just wasn't plugged in. All right, so But yeah, it's a story that I'm glad is on Wednesday nights to be with you adults and not to be with mixed company on Sunday mornings. That said, just like last week, we dealt with Joseph's angry brothers on Wednesday night and then dealt with the topic of anger on Sunday morning. So too tonight, we are dealing with sexual immorality and dysfunction that comes with that. Really, the sexual immorality is the symptom of deeper issues going on. The deeper issues going on will be our focus, but we will have to deal with those. So too Sunday morning, we're going to be dealing with sexual immorality again. It wasn't planned that way. That's just how it worked out. But as we are to the point of the Sermon on the Mount, to where Jesus tells them, you have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery, but I say to you that anyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And so we will be dealing with that Sunday morning. One of the things throughout my ministry is I have preached on issues such as that. We have provided a children's church for all children ages 6th grade and down, so that we don't have to, so that I don't have to try to sidestep issues, but we can deal with the issues head on. And and some people may say, well, that's odd talking about that in church. Well, listen, this issue is not being ignored by the world. It's being talked about. And if the church isn't talking about it, then our children, our grandchildren, our teenagers, our young adults, really people of all ages, if the church isn't talking about it, then they're only getting it from the world. And so we're going to have to talk about it. And that's good because the Bible talks about it. When we preach expositorily and we go through books of the Bible, we teach and we preach what God talks about. And this is part of it. So tonight, the story of Judah and his daughter-in-law Tamar. Now, the vast majority of chapters 37 through 50 are about Joseph. But secondarily, we do learn about Judah from here. And really, it's the telling of all of Jacob's children. So it makes sense for us to pause from Joseph for a chapter to focus on Judah, because really the focus is of the generations of Jacob. But again, there is a secondary focus in these 14 chapters on Judah and the Lord's work in Judah's life. And tonight we zero in on Judah and Judah's family. So we'll begin by looking at verses 1 through 19, and you can follow along as I read those. It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adulamite whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. He took her and went into her, and she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name She conceived again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. Yet again she bore a son, and she called his name Shelah. Judah was in Chezib when she bore him. And Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so whenever he went into his brother's wife, he would waste his semen on the ground so as not to give offspring to his brother. And what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah, my son, grows up, for he feared that he would die like his brothers. So Tamar went and remained in her father's house. In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah was confronted, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shears, he and his friend Hira the Adulamite. And when Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear sheep, she took off her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil, wrapping herself up, and sat at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown up, and she had not been given to him in marriage. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. he turned to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come into you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me that you may come into me?" He answered, "I will send you a young goat from the flock." And she said, "If you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your signet and your cord and your staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. Oh boy, we live in a wicked, sinful, messed up world. Soap operas don't hold a candle to the book of Genesis and to the sinfulness of real life. There's a lot going on here. So looking at Judah, kind of point number one from our story tonight is that Judah doesn't trust the Lord, or the first thing that we learn, verses 1 through 19, Judah doesn't trust the Lord. All of this chaos that's going on here, all of this stems from Judah not trusting the Lord. But Moses, as he's writing this, he also shows how Judah changes from a heartless son who doesn't trust the Lord to one who is willing to sacrifice himself for another. Now, that comes later on in chapter 44, but Moses is setting the table for this change in Judah's life here in this story. We think back to last week in chapter 37, as the brothers were going to kill Joseph because they were angry at the favoritism that Jacob showed him, and also just the foolishness of Joseph having these dreams that the Lord gave him, and then whether it was out of pride or out of naivety, gloating to his brothers that he had these dreams from God, that he was one day going to be their ruler and they were going to bow down to him. So they get angry and they're going to kill him. But Reuben, wanting to save the brother, says, "Nope, let's not kill him. Let's throw him in the pit." Reuben was then going to go back and save him later on. But while he was in the pit, chapter 37 tells us that it was Judah's idea to sell him as a slave to the Ishmaelites that were traveling by. That's chapter 37. Then by chapter 44, after Joseph has already made it to Egypt, he's the second most powerful man in the world. The worldwide drought has happened. The world is coming to him, and the brothers have to go to him. Judah at that point then tells of how he is the one who is willing to sacrifice himself. He's willing to give up his own life for Benjamin because Joseph had requested that he give proof that Benjamin is still alive. He wants to see Benjamin, but Jacob is not willing to let Benjamin leave. He says, "Look, I've already lost his brother." He thinks Joseph's dead. And so he says, "Look, I've already lost his brother. I'm not going to lose him as well." Reuben, wonderful guy, he doesn't pledge himself. He pledges his sons. And he says, "Look, we promise you we'll bring him back alive. If we don't bring him back alive, then I'll kill my sons." Upstanding father. Judah, though, takes it a step further and says, "Look, if we don't bring him back alive, then I'll give my own life for him. I promise you that much, my life for his life, that will make this happen." But we're not to that point yet. We're to a more difficult point in this story. Before Judah has changed, we see Judah is living in sin. He's not trusting the Lord. And we find here that Judah marries a Canaanite, who, of course, we were told that we couldn't do. We're not supposed to marry Canaanites. We're supposed to marry people who are of the people of God. We've already learned about this, how much trouble Esau caused within his family, how much trouble he caused to Isaac and Rebekah when he married Canaanite women. Not only did it cause family problems, but it also dishonors God because it's a sin against God. He's breaking God's command. Judah also fails as a father. His son followed in his dad's footsteps and also marries a Canaanite woman, Tamar. Ends up being so evil that God just takes his life. God kills him. God takes his life. It was then Onan's responsibility to fulfill the Levirate vow. Now, this is one of those aspects of Israelite life that, praise the Lord, we don't still have now because it's not needed. In that time period, of course, a woman's only means of sustenance was through the men in her family. And so if a woman becomes a widow and she does not have a son who would then be able to care for her, and she also then would be able to have a heritage, it was the job of the deceased husband's brother to then bring her in as a wife, provide a child through her, but that child would not be his. That child would be the child of his deceased brothers. So biologically, it would be his, but technically they would function as if he was the uncle. Doesn't matter if he was already married. That was the means of providing for the woman and providing a heritage and a lineage, not just for her, but for the deceased brother. That was the expectation. Well, Onan, the brother, he has to fulfill this duty. He has to fulfill this vow. But he doesn't. He doesn't do what is necessary to make sure that she bears children. And this is where the Catholic Church has gotten a lot of their views in regards to my brain's going blank here. In regards, anyways, to protection against getting pregnant. They take this verse along with some others and use it completely out of context. All right? And so they're not saying that every time you're intimate, that you just leave everything in God's hands. That's not what the Bible is teaching. Roman Catholics have taken that to mean that. That's not what the Bible's teaching. What was going on here, what was so wicked for Onan, wasn't what he actually did, but was the reasons why he was doing it. The whole reason he was supposed to be having an intimate relationship with Tamar was to provide a child for her and also for his deceased brother. But upon refusing to do that, what was happening then was what it boiled down to is that Onan was using Tamar for his own satisfaction. He was using Tamar, deceiving Tamar, using her for his own pleasure, but refusing to fulfill his responsibility to her, his brother, and ultimately the Lord. And so as we look more at that, essentially what it boiled down to, you very easily could say that Onan was raping her. Or that Onan at least was abusing her. Because the only reason she was with him to begin with was to fulfill this vow, to fulfill this command, but he was deceiving her, refusing to do it. And so God said, you are just as wicked as your brother, and God takes his life as well. And so next, there was a third brother. And so according to the Levirate vow, it was then that brother's duty, but that brother was still a young child and not yet of age. And so what was supposed to happen is she then was supposed to go live with her father until that brother was of age. And then when that brother was of age, the Levirate vow was supposed to happen and there was supposed to be a family. Again, praise the Lord, we are no longer under the law, but we are under the grace of God, and we are not having to live such as that. But what happens as that third child grows up, and even when he becomes of age, Judah then refuses to provide his third son to Tamar. Thus, Tamar now has no heritage, has no lineage, has no means of sustenance. She essentially has no family, and the same for the oldest brother, Judah is withholding from Tamar what is rightfully hers. We think about what Paul says in 1 Timothy 5:8. Paul tells us that anyone who fails to provide for their own family, especially their immediate family, is worse than an unbeliever. Onan first failed to do this, and God took his life. Now, Judah is doing the exact same thing, though in a different way, and certainly not as bad, but Judah's doing the same thing by refusing to provide a husband and thus a son for Tamar. And so as we look at this, we realize this is weird and not life as we see it today, but we must not take this lightly. Now let's think through this. Why would Judah do this? Why would Judah refuse to give child number 3 to Tamar? It's very simple. The first 2 of his sons that married her died. And if the third one goes to her and he dies as well, now Judah's without children. And Judah's childless. And so Judah says, I've lost my first 2 doing this. I'm not going to do the third one. Instead of trusting the Lord that the Lord knows what is best and entrusting my son with the Lord, I'm anxious and nervous and fearful that he's going to die. So I'm going to seek to control the circumstances in his life to ensure that he is safe and that he is okay. Judah had weak faith. Judah did not believe that by being obedient to the Lord that life would be better than by disobeying. Judah believed that if I control my circumstances and my family's life, life will be better for me than if I obey. And so he disobeyed the Lord. Judah had weak faith. What led to all of this dysfunction was his weak faith. He doubted God. He didn't see any way that giving the third son to Tamar would turn out for good, so he disobeyed. Tamar, though, takes matters into her own hands, and we see Tamar's deception of Judah. After Judah's wife's death, so the Canaanite wife that Judah had wrongly married, after she dies, he goes through his period of grieving and then joins his shepherds for wool gathering season, which is more than just gathering wool. It is a time of great partying and drinking. So we have the widower Judah, who is going to a big party. And in the very next verse, we find, in contrast, we learn of Tamar, that Tamar is still wearing her widow's garments. Tamar is still grieving. She is still in the season of widowhood, whereas Judah has moved on. Even after mourning both and Onan a long time, she is still in the widow's garments. And as a reader, this should be shocking to us at this kind of deceptive move. But the way that Moses writes this, the focus in what happens with Judah and Tamar, with her pretending to be a prostitute, seducing her father-in-law, getting pregnant with her father-in-law's child, Tamar is not the one that the focus is on for being wrong. The sinful focus of this is actually on Judah and Judah's actions. As Moses is writing this, it's almost as if his sympathy is with Tamar for the wrong that Judah's family continues to do to her. Now, clearly, Tamar is wrong. We've talked about this before. It's the same as I talked about with anger. Nobody can make you angry. Maybe somebody presents the circumstances for your anger, but nobody makes you angry. So to Tamar, nobody can make her sin, but Judah and his sons provided the circumstances to where Tamar thought, this is my only option. It wasn't her only option, but it was. And for Moses, it's almost like it's wrong, it's sinful, but it's understandable because of how Judah and his sons had treated her. When we read it in our understanding of our culture, it's like, wow, how could Tamar do that? But as the people in this culture are reading it, they're saying, wow, how could Judah do that? The focus in this writing is not on Tamar, though Tamar was wrong, the focus was on Judah. Judah has a history as we've seen up to this point, we're about to move on to verses 20 through 26. Judah has a history of taking things into his own hands when life gets difficult. Issue with younger brother, the father shows favoritism. We're treated as nobodies compared to the wonderful brother Joseph. So what do? Let's kill him. All right, maybe we won't be that bad, but we'll sell him into slavery. We'll take care of him and lie. Got these issues with my sons. I don't want my sons to die, so I'm going to disobey the Lord. Take matters into my own hands instead of trusting the Lord. And so when life gets difficult, it takes matters in his own hands instead of trusting the Lord. Verses 20 through 26, we then see Judah in his pride is humbled. You can follow along, chapter 38, 20 through 26. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend, the Adullamite, to take back the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. And he asked the men of the place, "Where's the cult prostitute who is at Enaim at the roadside?" And they said, "No cult prostitute has been here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I have not found her." Also the men of the place said, "No cult prostitute has been here." And Judah replied, "Let her keep the things as her own, or we shall be laughed at. You see, I sent this young goat, and you did not find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral. Moreover, she is pregnant by immorality." And Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, "By the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant." And she said, "Please identify whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff." Then Judah identified them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." And he did not know her again. So Judah in his pride is humbled. We see Judah sending money to pay off the supposed prostitute. Then we see Judah getting word that his daughter-in-law is pregnant by immorality. So he has just been immoral and is in fact trying to pay his dues for his immorality when he finds out about his daughter-in-law's immorality, which leads her to being angered and for him calling for her to be burned at the stake. He wants her to be burned to death for the exact same sin that he committed. This is hypocrisy to the nth degree. This is sinful judging. This is hypocritical judging. Again, going back to the Sermon on the Mount, which we'll eventually get to Matthew chapter 7, we find verses 1 through 5. Matthew 7:1 says, "Judge not that you be not judged." I've always said that this is the second most famous verse in the entire Bible outside of John 3:16. You confront anybody on sin, "Hold on, pastor, judge not lest you too be judged." We're not supposed to be going around judging. Everybody knows, "Judge not lest you too be judged." Judge not, judge not. But remember, we use the Bible to interpret the Bible. What's going on throughout the rest of the Bible and also here in Matthew chapter 7? Well, 2 Corinthians 5, Paul tells the Corinthian church, he says, "Is it not those inside the church whom you are to be judging? Let God judge those outside. You judge those inside the church." So how do we reconcile 1 Corinthians 5 and Matthew 7? Well, we reconcile it by reading the rest of Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 5, and see the immediate context in which this was given. He says, verse 2, "For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. This is not a matter of whether you should judge or whether you should not judge. This is rather a matter of how you are to go about doing the judging. It's how you pronounce it. It's with the measure you use. And then, are you doing it hypocritically?" Verses 3 and 4. "Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when there is the log that is in your own eye?" Again, many people take this out of context and say, "You can't be judging. What about the log in your eye?" Hold on. Again, context. What is actually being taught here? We look at verse 5, which is the last sentence of that paragraph. And we find there in verse 5 that this passage is actually commanding us to judge. Listen to this. You hypocrite. First, take the log out of your own eye. Then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. This isn't about not judging. That passage is about how to biblically and rightly remove the speck from your brother's eye. Another way of saying it is how to confront sin in one of your brothers. This is a passage telling us to do it, but how am I to do it? I can't do it hypocritically. And also, I need to take the log out of my eye. I need to deal with my sin, not only because if I deal with theirs without dealing with mine, that makes me a hypocrite, but oftentimes my sin actually distorts my view of the other person. And as I deal with my own sin, I come to find out, wait a second, he doesn't have a speck in his own eye at all. That was just a log I've got in mine. He's actually not in sin. Or maybe, okay, he is in sin, but it's not nearly as bad as I thought. Or maybe he's still in sin. It is bad, but now I have a different understanding of it. Well, Judah here, not only is he judging, but he's ready to execute his daughter-in-law for committing the exact same sin that he committed. That is pride and hypocrisy to the nth degree. Judah, throughout this story, has shown zero care to live according to God's promise. He's shown zero care to provide Abraham with many faithful grandsons. Should be great-grandsons by this point. Great-great-grandsons. Y'all get what I'm saying. In contrast, Scripture almost seems to speak well of Tamar. So Judah, nothing good has been said. Zero care for God's promises, zero care for his daughter-in-law. He's got wicked sons who have no care for the Lord. He's going out living in sexual immorality. He's prideful. He's a hypocrite. He wants to burn his daughter-in-law to death for committing the exact same sin that he just committed. We continue to look at Tamar. She didn't go back home and take a Canaanite husband. She could have. Rather, she stayed faithful and waited for Judah to give Shelah to her. She also understood the importance and necessity of bearing children. Now, again, she went about it a horrible way. Listen, if you are ever tempted to seduce your father-in-law, it's a bad idea, right? Like, that's not going to turn out well. Like, bad idea. That is clear. Don't do it. That is a sin. She made not only a foolish choice, but a terribly sinful choice. Yet at the same time, Judah left her in a very bad position. And as she confronts Judah, and as Judah wants to burn her to death, and she says the one who's responsible for this child is the one who owns this signet. And it was David's "you are the man" moment when the prophet Nathan confronted him. You are that man. When she handed that signet, it was that moment. It was the weight of sin. I've been caught. I'm wrong. And it's in this moment that we see the change begin to take place in Judah's life, to where Judah is no longer viewed as this wicked, sinful man, but now a repentant man who eventually will be a forefather of the Messiah. Verses 27 through 30. Let me get back to Genesis. I forgot to put my bookmark there. Genesis 38, 27 through 30. And when the time of her labor came, there were twins in her womb. And when she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, "This one came out first." But as he drew back his hand, behold, his brother came out. And she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." Therefore his name was called Perez. Afterward, his brother came out with a scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah. As we look not just at these verses, but as the story as it unfolds throughout the rest of history, Judah is redeemed by God and becomes a forefather of the Messiah. As we look at the wickedness and the sin of Judah, not only in chapter 37, but chapter 38, we come to see that no one is outside of the grace of God. We saw this in Paul, who prior to that was Saul. As Stephen is stoned, he's in with authority. He's looking over it, or in a place of authority. He's looking over that murder with approval. He is going to Damascus to find Christians to throw them in jail simply for the purpose of being a Christian. Paul was a wicked, horrible, murderous man. Yet he meets Jesus and he becomes the most faithful man who's ever lived outside of Jesus. And we see the same thing happening with Judah. No one is outside of the grace of God. Judah was a cold, heartless man, willing to kill and then sell his brother into slavery. Judah, as a father, clearly did not raise his sons to believe and follow the promises of God. Judah, as a father-in-law, was indifferent towards the plight of his widowed daughter-in-law. Judah was a man living in blatant immorality. He was a man willing to burn his daughter-in-law to death for the exact same sin that he committed. Yet God confronts his sin. God changes him. Judah acknowledges his sin. He is willing to give up his own life. As we said at the beginning of this sermon in chapter 44, he's willing to sacrifice his own life to guarantee Benjamin's survival. Chapter 37, he's wanting to kill his brother. Now he's willing to sacrifice his life for the life of his brother. And as a result of this change in Judah's life, at the end of Jacob's life, as he's giving all of his blessings, the blessing that normally goes to the oldest child, which is the greatest blessing, doesn't go to the firstborn, but goes to the fourthborn, to Judah. And then we trail the story all the way to the New Testament, Matthew chapter 1, and we look at the lineage of Jesus. And in that lineage, we find Judah, Tamar, and the baby of that incestuous, wicked relationship, Perez. The Lord has the means of making all things new. The Lord has the means of making us into new creations. The Lord has the means of taking a child that was born from incest and using him as a redeemed person to be a forefather of the Messiah. I wasn't planning on going here, but it's hitting me as I'm preaching. We think about abortion laws. Even states that are supposedly pro-life, all abortion is wrong, unless in the case of incest or rape or the mother's life. Perez was a baby born of incest. And yet the Lord redeemed that whole family to the point that they were in the lineage of Jesus. The Lord can make all things new, and we see that in Judah and in his family. But to do that, we got to trust the Lord. We can't take matters into our own hands. We got to say, Lord, it's your way. It's your way. I trust you. I'm following you. I'm doing it your way. All right. So for those of you who are watching at home, we appreciate you joining us, and we're going to move now to our time of prayer. So that I don't forget, I meant to mention this before while we were still on live stream.